Hello, I'm doing this lecture in my office in the early afternoon, so you're probably going to hear a lot of office noise in the background, but enjoy it. Hopefully you'll still be able to hear me, so it doesn't really matter whether you have that background noise or not. Alright, this lecture we're taking a look at demographic processes, population dynamics and metapopulations. The reason why we're talking about demographic processes, population dynamics and metapopulations is because you need to have some understanding on how populations of plants and animals change over time with different stresses to understand how to conserve them. So I'm going to give you an introduction to these demographic processes. You probably covered these already in your ecology course, or maybe not metapopulations and source and sink populations, but hopefully once you've seen this lecture you will be able to see how I'm thinking when we talk about conservation actions in the future. Right, so in this lecture I want to talk a little bit about population ecology and in particular population regulation. And there are two main types of population regulation: density dependent population regulation and density independent population regulation, or basically lack of regulation, I guess. And then I want to talk a little bit about the hierarchical processes of population regulation, how regulation can be pitched at different scales, and we'd need to know that because we'd need to identify some of the processes which are humbugging our protected species at whatever level of population regulation. Then I want to move on to source and sink dynamics, something which is very important and something which you need to know when you are considering designing protected area networks and so on. And part of that is metapopulations, or how populations which are separated in a landscape may act or interact to support each other over a longer period of time. And finally, leading on from metapopulations and source and sink dynamics, I want to take a look at a landscape approach to conservation biology. But first of all, population ecology, some definitions in population ecology to remind you of when you were doing it back in the day when you were doing your ecology courses. Population, what is a population? A group of interbreeding organisms of the same species. Okay, so it's a group of individuals which can interbreed, which more or less in the same area, so that they can interbreed and have a similar genetic pool shared between them and their offspring. Demography is the study of populations, how populations increase or decrease, etc. And the characteristics of populations are also covered in population ecology, in particular the processes of natality or birth rates, mortality or death rates, immigration and emigration, colonization and dispersal respectively, density or the numbers of individuals within a particular area in a population, distribution or how individuals of that population are distributed within the population area, the age structure within the population. Are there lots of young, or is it biased more towards old individuals? The growth rates of the populations, some of the interactions, the biotic interactions of the population within the population, between individuals within the population, okay, which may have important implications for overall population dynamics, and interactions with other species outside of the population, which again may have some very important implications for these other population characteristics like birth and death and so on. If we take those different characteristics of population, ecology, birth, death, immigration, migration, etc., and we can consider them under the title of population regulation. Now, when you think about it, population regulation is probably one of the more important things that you need to consider when you're trying to conserve a species. Okay? Now, population regulation is basically how a population of a species grows or dwindles or is basically maintained. Now, there are two main types of population regulation, and they both act to make sure that a population doesn't grow indefinitely. Okay, so there is some sort of limit to the population. And there are two main types of regulation. Now, these are two opposite ends of a spectrum, and many species would fall somewhere in between those two endpoints. But we do have some examples of some of the more extreme species at one end or the other of the spectrum. The first type of population regulation is density-independent regulation. Now, this is basically population growth while resources last, and there's no parameters, no characteristics of the population which slow the growth of the population down. So the population will continue to grow without regard to how many individuals there are in the population until all the resources run out, and then the population will crash. It'll go from the highest that it's ever been to very few individuals, to the lowest that it's ever been in a short space of time, as all the individuals within the population die out because of lack of resources to eat. So density independent regulation, as I got there, is usually catastrophic. It's quite often recurrent. It's recurrent because the very act of growing your population exponentially and eating out all the resources means that you have a boom and then a bust. Once you have that bust and low levels of individuals within your population, then the resources that are relied on by the population get a chance to recover. And once the resources have recovered enough, okay, so it may be vegetation to eat, for instance, then the cycle of boom will start again. Eventually it will bust and crash once more. The population will continue to grow regardless of population density. Okay, so populations will continue to grow regardless of how many individuals there are. That's just the genetic program of these density independent species. They are programmed to grow and use up all the available resources. These types of species are also known as R-selected species, okay, or ruderal or unstable, unpredictable species, and they specialize in unstable, unpredictable environments where resources can become very available at any time. Okay, so resources are not tied up, okay, as such. So these species will try and capture as many of those resources as possible and have as many offspring as possible while those resources exist. Once the resources disappear, then they will just crash once again. So unpredictable, unstable environments would be around volcanoes, fire-prone environments, or hurricane damage environments. the growth pattern is characterized by J-shaped curves, and the J-shaped curve is the blue one in this diagram. So if we have a line here which represents the carrying capacity for this particular species, okay, as you can see, the population of this species starts out low. It trundles along and doesn't get very much bigger very quickly for a while. It grows quite slowly. It may look like this line is parallel, but it is just growing slowly until some threshold is reached and a density of the population is reached where mating and reproduction reaches optimal efficiency, and then the population begins to grow exponentially, and it just shoots up, and population growth just continues to get faster and faster as the density of the population increases and reproduction efficiency increases. Okay, and it just keeps on going, and it overshoots the carrying capacity. Once the population goes beyond the carrying capacity, the resource which it feeds off begins to be damaged and reduced, and the numbers of individuals which can be supported begins to reduce until a point is reached where the population can no longer be sustained, and not just one or two individuals die out, the whole lot of them die out, and the population crashes back down. We can see that best here in this diagram, looking at the snowshoe hare. Okay, the snowshoe hare is a typical density independent organism, and it goes through boom and bust cycles. Okay, and notice that these cycles are not over the course of a single year. Instead, the population will boom over the course of a couple of years until it peaks. Okay, and the population of rabbits or snowshoe hares is increased dramatically until the resources are all used out. Okay, there may have been a good, well, actually looking at this graph, the population of hares crashed, and that allowed the forage on which they fed to grow back again over a few years. And once it grown back over a particular amount, and the density of the snowshoe hares had recovered enough, the population was off again and takes off till all the resources are eaten out, nothing but bare earth left. The population crashes back down again, slowly begins to recover, reaches over to the point, crashes once again, begins to recover, reaches a point, crashes once again. Okay, the snowshoe hare is also considered a resource for the lynx. The lynx is a small cat, okay, around the size of an ocelot, really, maybe a bit bigger, and it preys on these snowshoe hares. Okay, the lynx populations go more or less in sync with its resource populations. So the populations of hares will increase when the population of lynxes will increase while there's enough hares around for them to eat. Okay, but when the population of hare crashes, the lynx numbers crash as well. Okay, always slightly behind the peaks of the hares. Okay, whenever the hare population crashes, the lynx population crashes. You see, so these two species, because they are so much intertwined, the population levels basically mirror or track one another. Excuse me, that's the phone. Just a minute. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, we have these density independent hares increasing in population levels and then crashing back down again. Okay, now one of the problems with this is that at times the populations of hares are very low. Okay, and as you all know, a population size which is very low is very vulnerable to extinction. Okay, Another type of population regulation is density dependent regulation. This is probably similar, well, the population growth is similar, at least initially, to density independent regulation, until a certain density of the population is reached. Once that density of population is reached, then the species begins to control its own population growth. Okay, so it has biological factors inherent in its behavior and its resource gathering strategies and so on, which basically mean that the species does not increase its population size beyond the carrying capacity. Okay, instead the population size levels out just above or just below or just on the carrying capacity of the environment. Okay, so this means that the populations of these density dependent species, also known as K-selected species for the carrying capacity of the environment, so K is taken to indicate carrying capacity of the environment, they will be able to survive at or around the carrying capacity of the environment. Okay, some of the mechanisms by which these K-selected species maintain their populations at or around the carrying capacity level are things like behavioral things, like the adults or the males or the established individuals within the population will actively drive out the offspring and disperse them so that they don't remain around and compete with the adults for resources. Okay, and so in that way the density of the population remains pretty much the same. So the shape of that curve is such as what we see with the red curve there. So the blue one is the density independent, the red curve is the density dependent growth of a density dependent species or a K-selected species. Okay, you can see it a bit better down here on this diagram. So initially the population growth is small, just like in the density independent species, and then the threshold is passed and the population starts to take off. But unlike the density independent, once the density is reached, a certain critical density is reached, the population growth begins to slow, and eventually it stops at around or just underneath the carrying capacity for that species in the environment. So the types of species that we have which are K-selected species are elephants. They are able to control the density of their population. Cassowaries, which are a type of rainforest emu which is found in Australia and in Papua New Guinea, or New Guinea I should say. These species remain at a similar density. One characteristic of both these species is that they are quite mobile on the landscape. So the elephants and the cassowaries can disperse and so lessen their density by emigration. Okay? So if we look at a closer detail of how the population oscillates around the carrying capacity, it may go through a series of oscillations, but by no means as wild, and the amplitude is much smaller. The amplitude of the oscillations is much smaller than the density independent species. Okay, so populations may oscillate around the carrying capacity with to a greater or lesser extent, but there's no population crashes like you would get with the R-selected species. Okay, so those are the two main types of population regulation, and those are the things that we would need to watch out for. As you can imagine, if you're trying to conserve a R-selected species, you are probably going to have a different conservation strategy than if you are trying to conserve a K-selected species. Okay. I just want to talk about some hierarchical processes of population regulation now. Okay. Conservation actions in terms of population ecology can be thought of at different levels. We may think of population processes, population regulation processes at the individual level, okay, at the population level, at the land and at the landscape level. And there are different characteristics or processes or population regulation processes at different levels. So at an individual level there would be things like feeding rates, growth rates, habitat selection and predator avoidance. So each individual within the population would have different feeding rates, growth rates, habitat selection, characteristics and predator avoidance behavior. Okay? Now, if we find that a species population is dwindling, we may look at the individual level to see whether we can manipulate any of these characteristics. Okay, so it's certainly the case for some reintroduced animals that predator avoidance behavior can be missing. So at an individual level, the population is not surviving because the new individuals in the population are being killed out because they don't have that predator avoidance behavior. So at an individual level you may be able to manipulate that by training these individuals to avoid predators. Okay, do that by, I don't know, giving them an electric shock when they smell the predator, something like that, so they soon learn to run away from the predator. Okay, feeding rates and growth rates may be managed at an individual level by supplementary feeding of an individual to allow it to survive. Okay, population level regulation, things that we spoke about earlier, birth rates, death rates, immigration, emigration. These rates will control whether population level increases or decreases. Okay, population levels will increase if birth rates are high and decrease if death rates are high. Population levels will increase if population levels will increase if immigration is high and decrease if emigration is high. Okay, and again we can manipulate these different rates. We can increase the birth rates by doing things like double clutching, which is basically removing the eggs from adults of a species that we need to increase the birth rates, and giving them to a surrogate to raise and allowing the original parents to have another clutch, and so double the reproductive rate of the remaining individuals. We can manage death rates by reducing the number of predators on a species that we're interested in. Reducing the number of predators will decrease the death rates and therefore increase the population. We can help with immigration and emigration. We can link up a habitat to an area which has the same species so that the species may immigrate and help one another. Okay, so if the population is too small, then individuals from the other side may come over and help bolster the population. And by the same token, if our population is too big and density dependent effects or the density independent crash is coming, we can help with that immigration, and we can take individuals out of the population and relocate them elsewhere to maintain a stable population level. We can also have landscape level processes of population regulation. Habitat change or land use change, which changes the habitat, can have a big impact on birth rates and death rates, immigration and emigration, and therefore feeding rates, growth rates, habitat selection, and so on. Okay. Climate change may influence the environments which are found, which again will influence birth rates and death rates and so on. Succession and disturbance will also influence populations as well. Right, this is the same one as before, so I can get rid of that. Okay, I think you know enough now to talk about source and sink dynamics. All these population measures assume that the habitat in which species live is uniform, that it's the same across it, so that the amount of resources which is found in one part of the landscape is just as good as the resources which are found in another part of the landscape. Now, as you probably surmise, that is a load of rubbish. There are good parts of the landscape which form good habits, where reproductive success may be much greater than mortality. Okay, there's a lot of food there, for instance, or a lot of habitat which allows the species to hide and reduce predation rates. Okay, so these habitats will quite often have a growing population. Okay, because in many cases they are not density independent, the individuals which generated in these places, the offspring, need to disperse somewhere else to find a place to live out their lives. So these excess individuals must disperse outside of their birth patch or natal patch to find a place to settle down and breed. Okay, so source habitats are habitats where population levels are always increasing. They're very nice habitats where birth rate outstrips the death rate. Okay, so the excess individuals under pressure from density dependent effects must disperse outwards. Okay, and that's what they do. So these habitats are always constantly a source of this particular species. On the other side are the sink habitats. Sink populations are poor habitats where local productivity is less, or local natality is less than the local mortality. So the population is not increasing then. It is shrinking as there are more members of the population dying than there are births to replace that population. So sink populations are shrinking, and without some sort of immigration from the source habitats, the populations would likely become extinct. Okay? Most species would have both source and sink populations, and individuals would transfer from the source populations to the sink populations. An example of that may be the manatee here in Trinidad. In Nariva Swamp there is a small population of manatee, and it's probably too small to be genetically viable, and it's probably too small to be too secure against things like hunting, disease, maybe a cyclone, hurricane or two. So these manatee populations in Trinidad is very small, maybe less than 10 individuals. So it is likely not to be a self-sustaining population. Instead, the population is probably topped up or maintained by dispersing individual manatees which come from the swamps and the rivers and the estuaries of the Orinoco Delta and some of the large continental rivers around Guyana. So these manatees are able to disperse across the ocean when they get kicked out by too high a density, and they will home in on the freshwater rivers which are coming out of the interior of Trinidad, and in particular the Nariva swamp. So there you may have a source and sink population. Okay, without emigration into the sink habitats, populations of the sink habitats would probably become extinct. So we don't know, maybe those Nariva manatees rely on constant replenishment from the mainland South America. Some of the other populations or species with source and sink habitats where some of the classic work was done in California, this butterfly, I think it's a fritillary, heath fritillary or something like that. Its habitats are the tops of these ridges. Okay, they like the plants which grow in these rocky outcrops, and in between these rocky outcrops you would have grassland prairies which the butterfly can cross, but is not really any good for them in terms of things to eat and so on. These rocky outcrops are scattered across the landscape, as you imagine rocky outcrops would be. Okay, and so the populations of this butterfly are scattered across the landscape following these rocky habitats. Okay, so these populations are relatively distinct, but as I said, the butterflies can fly across the grasslands, and when density in the source populations become high enough, the offspring will disperse outwards into these other patches. Okay? Now these other patches may be subject to fire or disease or some sort of problem, and the whole population of these butterflies may become extinct at any one time. The population of the source habitat may even become extinct if some hurricane passes directly over the top or a fire passes directly over the top. But as long as one of the other populations, which may be a sink population, it doesn't matter, is still around when this population is destroyed, they can recolonize the source habitat and so keep the overall population going. Okay, so this butterfly has source habitat and sink habitat, and it is linked together by immigration between the two. It can basically fly over the grassland. Our next example is the tree kangaroo. So there's a little tree kangaroo, very cute. It's a kangaroo which lives up in trees. Its main habitat is the Mabi semi-deciduous forest, of which 95% has been cleared. So the remaining forest is this grey area, and you can see all the patches of this grey area throughout what is known as the Atherton Tablelands in Australia, up here in the northeast corner of Australia. These tree kangaroos live in these forests, these patches. Okay. Now, as you can see, they're fairly isolated. Some patches are going to be very productive and allow the tree kangaroos to breed, but when they get offspring, what is going to happen to those offspring? They need to be able to disperse across all this farmland to the next habitat, and they're going to be prey to dogs, they're going to get tangled up in fences, they're going to lose their way. So these guys are at a real disadvantage. They're not adapted to crossing these farmlands. So what humans have been doing is planting these corridors of trees along things like watercourses and so on to link up these fragments. So these tree kangaroos will be able to recolonize the other patches and so increase their population size. Okay? Cassowaries have a similar sort of habitat niche to the tree kangaroos. Tree kangaroos are up in the trees, but the cassowaries are on the ground. But they both need that tropical rainforest to survive. Okay? So this gives rise to what is known as source and sink dynamics, and the population is known as a metapopulation. Basically, it's several distinct subpopulations linked together by periodic immigration and emigration. Okay? So most of the time the demographic rates of the populations is pretty much determined by the individual of the species in the patch as they go along. But every so often immigration and emigration occurs, most notably from the source populations to the sink populations, so that the overall metapopulation is maintained, even though the sink populations may actually be shrinking or reducing in size. They are helped by immigration, and this process is much more common in the real world than most people realize. And it does mean that it's bad to fragment the habitat, because these fragmented isolated populations, which are not connected by dispersal corridors, means that pretty soon all the species will disappear from the sink populations. Okay? And the capacity of the landscape to hold a large enough population for the species to survive is pretty severely compromised. So these metapopulations need to be linked in some way. There need to be some way in which individuals from one patch of habitat can move across to another patch of habitat if need be. Okay? So recognition of source and sink populations is crucial for conservation biology. Until recently, critical habitats were defined as the places where a species was most common. And this may have been a misnomer, because these habitats where the species was most common may simply have been the largest area of poor habitat, which therefore then had the highest numbers of individuals within the species. But the source habitat, which is much smaller but was very productive, meant that the individuals within the source habitat was basically supporting the larger population in the sink habitat. But if we come in and then put a protected area over this sink habitat, which is large and generally has the largest population of our animal, and then we wonder why, after we clear the source habitat, okay, that the species is still in trouble and begins to dwindle in numbers. What's going on, we say? Okay, and the problem is that you have destroyed your source habitat and therefore disturb the metapopulation dynamics of the area. So conservation should focus on preserving the habitat where the species is most productive, where it creates the most offspring, and certainly not necessarily where that species is more common. Alright, this is so much so that as little as 10% of the population, the metapopulation, may be in source habitats, and that little 10% of the population may be maintaining the remaining 90% of the population found in the sink habitats. So how do we find out which is the source habitats and which are the sink habitats? Basically, you need to do detailed studies of the demography of the population in each habitat type, okay, across the landscape, so you can see which populations are source and which are sink. It brings into stark contrast, or brings into stark relief, the importance of preserving small populations. Okay, if a small source population needs to be survived, a conservation biologist must put in extra effort to survive it. Okay, so that leads to a landscape approach to conservation biology, because the landscape is those mosaic of habitat patches, whether they be source or sink habitat patches, and organisms need to live and move between these habitat patches. So we need to try and minimize the fragmentation of these habitats, and if they are fragmented, build corridors of habitat which allows the population, individuals of the population, metapopulation, to travel between these different patches. And that's what a lot of the restoration work in Australia is doing. It's trying to link together the remaining patches of good habitat for species like the tree kangaroo and the cassowary, and a number of other species as well, like bandicoots and paddymellons and wallabies, okay, so that this fragmented habitat can work together as one metapopulation, and one population, be it a sink or a source population, can rescue other populations which may be in trouble due to some sort of stochastic event like a fire or something like that. So watch out for metapopulations and that landscape approach to conservation biology in your subsequent lectures. I believe Dr. Phillips may invoke metapopulations when she's talking about protected areas. Okay, so there you go. That's all I've got for you for metapopulations today. Thank you.